The boarding gate froze in uneasy silence. A flight attendant stood with her arms crossed, blocking the path of a middle-aged man holding out his ticket and papers. Her voice, sharp enough to cut through the airport noise, dripped with disdain. "Sir, this isn't a game. These documents look fake, and frankly, you don't look the part." Gasps rippled through the line behind him. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, torn between pity and suspicion. The man didn't flinch. His posture was calm, his gaze steady, as if he'd endured this kind of treatment before. But the attendant pressed on, raising her voice so the whole gate could hear. "Do yourself a favor and stop pretending." What no one realized was that a single badge, resting quietly in his jacket, was about to shatter her arrogance and turn the entire gate into witnesses of her mistake. Before we go further, pause for just a moment. If you've ever witnessed arrogance explode in public, or worse, seen someone abuse their position of authority, share it in the comments below. I read every story, and they remind me how universal these moments of injustice really are. And if you enjoy these cinematic true-to-life stories, make sure you're subscribed, because the one you're about to hear will leave you stunned. By the end, you'll see how a single badge turned an entire gate of passengers into silent witnesses and brought one person's arrogance crashing down. The man at the center of it all didn't look like someone who carried influence. That was the first mistake people made about him. He was in his mid-50s, tall but not imposing, his posture straight yet relaxed, the kind of stance that suggested confidence without the need to prove anything. His clothes were plain, pressed slacks, a navy jacket that had clearly seen years of use, and polished shoes that were comfortable rather than flashy. No gold watch, no designer lose. Gauge. Just a well-worn leather briefcase and a single carry-on, tucked neatly at his side. To anyone else, he looked like just another traveler making his way across the world, quietly moving through the chaos of a crowded international terminal. And perhaps that's what he preferred. That morning had started long before sunrise. In the dim quiet of his home, he checked his itinerary twice, ensuring every detail was in order. His badge, his papers, his diplomatic passport, all carefully placed inside a slim folder, tucked precisely into the inner pocket of his jacket. He believed in preparation, not because he doubted himself, but because his work demanded it. Representing his country abroad wasn't about flashing authority. It was about patience, composure, and respect. As he walked through the terminal, the world around him was a blur of movement. Families herding children who darted in every direction, business travelers with briefcases, muttering into phones, their brows furrowed with deadlines, the echo of rolling suitcases across polished tiles. Overhead announcements called out destinations in a dozen different accents, filling the air with a mechanical kind of urgency. He blended into it all, unnoticed, just another passenger among the restless crowd. And yet, there was a quiet dignity about him. The way he paused for an elderly couple struggling with their bags, stepping aside to let them pass. The way he smiled politely at a young mother soothing her crying child. Small gestures, invisible to most, but they painted a picture of a man who respected people without needing to know their names. He wasn't rushing, though he could have. His boarding priority would have allowed him to cut ahead, but he queued with everyone else, standing in line with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime waiting through negotiations and discussions that stretched was beyond reason. For him, waiting wasn't an inconvenience, it was part of the job. The staff at the counter, however, weren't looking for patience or humility that day. They were tired, irritable. The morning rush had given way to the midday flood of departures, and tension was in the air. Short tempers met long lines. The smallest delay was met with a sigh, an eye roll, or a sharp tone. As he stepped forward, papers in hand, the flight attendant at the gate barely glanced at him before narrowing her eyes. Something about his quiet manner, his unassuming presence, rubbed her the wrong way. She saw the folder, the papers, the diplomatic credentials, and instead of respect, suspicion filled her face. To her, he didn't look the part. He didn't carry himself with the arrogance she expected from someone in power. There was no entourage trailing behind him, no expensive accessories announcing status. Just a man, alone, calm, holding documents that seemed too important for someone so ordinary. And so, in that instant, she decided he was pretending. Passengers shifted impatiently as the line slowed. He waited without complaint, offering his papers with steady hands. The attendant's tone grew sharper, her questions colder, the disbelief in her eyes unmistakable. Around them, the crowd began to stir, some curious, others irritated that their departure was being delayed. But the man didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice, didn't push back. That wasn't his way. His strength wasn't in loudness, it was in restraint. He had faced harsher words than these across negotiating tables, in boardrooms filled with distrust, in countries where every word mattered. A scornful attendant was hardly a storm compared to those days. Still, as the minutes passed, the humiliation began to take shape. Passengers whispered, eyebrows lifted. Some smirked at the sight of what they assumed was a fraud being caught. Others frowned at the harshness of her tone. But through it all, he remained composed, his hand resting lightly against his jacket pocket. The same pocket that held the one item that could end this entire charade in a second. Yet he didn't reveal it. Not yet. He believed in timing, in allowing arrogance to fully reveal itself before truth was set loose. And so he stood silently, waiting. What no one realized, not the impatient passengers, not the staff growing agitated, not even the attendant reveling in her authority, was that this ordinary-looking man carried more weight in his pocket than anyone in that terminal could imagine, and in just a few moments that weight would shift the entire atmosphere of the gate. The line of passengers shifted with growing impatience as the flight attendant squared her shoulders and leveled a hard stare at the man before her. Her lips pressed into a thin, dismissive smile, the kind that was less about courtesy and more about control. She tapped the corner of his documents against the counter, the sound sharp, deliberate, like a gavel slamming down. "Sir," she said, raising her voice just enough for the passengers behind him to hear, "this is not a playground. Do you think we don't see this kind of thing every day? Fake papers, fake badges, people trying to cheat their way into priority boarding." The words cut through the air, and a ripple of reaction spread through the line. A few passengers leaned forward, curious. Others exchanged skeptical glances, already passing quiet judgment. To them, it was entertainment. A fraud being caught in the act. Something to gossip about later, once the flight finally left the ground. But the man remained steady, his expression calm, his voice even. "These documents are authentic. They authorize my travel under diplomatic status." She raised an eyebrow, almost amused. "Diplomatic status? Really?" Her eyes flicked up and down his plain jacket, his modest shoes, the scuffed leather briefcase by his side. "You don't look like any diplomat I've ever seen. Tell me, where's your show? Or entourage? Where's your security detail?" The passengers chuckled softly, not at his expense, but at the audacity of her mocking tone. Still, the sting of her words lingered in the air. The man adjusted his stance, his hands never leaving his sides, his gaze never breaking from hers. "I travel alone," he replied, his voice carrying the quiet strength of someone who knew he didn't need to prove himself. She laughed, shaking her head. "Alone? Of course. Because high-ranking officials just wander through airports like this. Do you think I was born yesterday?" She held the papers up to the light, exaggerating every motion, twisting the pages between her fingers as if she might peel away the forgery with her bare hands. A passenger from the line muttered, "Looks pretty official to me." Another, an older man, frowned and whispered to his wife, "She's being awfully harsh, isn't she?" But the attendant ignored them, She had an audience now, and she thrived on it. Her voice grew louder, more pointed. You people always try the same tricks. Flash some fancy-looking document, claim you're someone important, and hope nobody checks. Well, not today. The ambassador inhaled slowly, letting her words hang in the air without answering immediately. His patience wasn't weakness, it was restraint. Every instinct told him to shut down her accusations with a single move, but years of diplomacy had taught him to wait, to let arrogance reveal itself fully before truth dismantled it. I assure you, he said finally, his tone measured, these documents will verify with your system. Please, take a moment to check them properly. Her lips curled into a smirk. Oh, I'll check them. I'll check them so thoroughly you'll wish you hadn't tried this stunt. And when security arrives, they'll escort you out in front of everyone here. Maybe that'll teach you not to waste people's time. The crowd stirred again. A young man near the front of the line shook his head, muttering under his breath, "This doesn't feel right." But most stayed silent, shifting impatiently, eager for the drama to resolve so they could board their flight. The attendant flipped the documents open and shut again, clearly not reading them, only going through the motions of authority. She wanted to be seen as the gatekeeper, the one who couldn't be fooled. Every exaggerated movement was theatre. You know what gives you away, she said, tilting her head, as if she were a detective unmasking a criminal. It's the way you carry yourself. Real officials don't act like you. They don't stand there so calmly. They don't wait in line with everyone else. They let people know who they are. He met her gaze without flinching. Respect isn't about announcing who you are, he said quietly. Her smirk faltered for a split second before she masked it again with a scoff. Spare me the lecture. You can tell your little story to airport security. Passengers behind him exchanged looks, some embarrassed for her, others quietly admiring the man's composure. A mother hushed her child, whispering, "Don't stare." But even she couldn't pull her own eyes away from the scene. The humiliation stretched on like a slow burn. Minute after minute, the attendant repeated herself, tossing out barbed remarks. She accused him of line-cutting, of holding up the flight, of trying to use forged paperwork to gain privileges he didn't deserve. Each time he tried to speak, she cut him off, twisting his words into further proof of guilt. "So what embassy did you say you're with?" she asked at one point, though she hadn't given him the chance to answer the first time. "No, let me guess. You'll say the American one, won't you? Because that's the biggest lie people try. Everyone wants to be American. Everyone wants to wave around a badge that doesn't exist." The ambassador's jaw tightened for the first time, but his voice remained calm. "I haven't lied to you. The truth is right in front of you." Her laughter rang sharp and cold. "If this is the truth, then I'm the Queen of England, and you, sir, are about to be escorted out by security." That last line drew nervous laughter from the crowd. Some of them were starting to realize she wasn't simply doing her job, she was enjoying the spectacle. And through it all, the man stood in silence when her words no longer required an answer. His dignity became a mirror, reflecting her arrogance for everyone to see. But she didn't notice. Not yet. She leaned closer, lowering her voice, though loud enough for those nearest to hear. "You're not fooling anyone. You're just another con artist trying to play dress-up, and I'm going to make sure you regret it." Passengers shifted uncomfortably. The tension in the air had thickened, heavy, suffocating. The gate was no longer a place of routine travel. It had become a stage, and every soul present was trapped in the performance. And still, the man's hand rested calmly against the jacket pocket where the badge waited. A single movement could have ended her mockery instantly. But he didn't move. Not yet. Because what she didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that true power doesn't rush. It waits. It allows arrogance to build its own downfall. And in that crowded terminal, the downfall was only just beginning. The ambassador stood motionless as the attendant's accusations piled higher and higher, like stones being stacked to build a wall around him. Each word was meant to crush his dignity, to corner him until he either lashed out or broke down. But neither happened. He let her voice echo off the glass walls of the terminal while he stood in silence, breathing evenly, his calmness unsettling in its strength. Passengers began to stir. Some crossed their arms, annoyed by the delay. Others lowered their eyes, uneasy about watching a man publicly humiliated. A few, though, leaned in closer, eager for the show, convinced they were witnessing a fraud exposed. The attendant thrived on that mix of judgment and discomfort. She had become the star of her own performance, and she relished every second. "Sir," she snapped, "security will be here any moment. You should have thought twice before trying this. The airline doesn't take kindly to imposters." Still, the man didn't argue. He lowered his gaze briefly, as though considering his next move, then slowly reached into his jacket pocket. For a split second, the crowd held its breath. The attendant stiffened, eyes narrowing, as if preparing to accuse him of something worse. But when his hand emerged, it wasn't holding a badge. Not yet. It was just his phone. Without a word, he unlocked the screen with a practiced swipe and typed a brief message. One line. No explanation. No panic. His thumb hovered for the faintest pause before pressing send. Then he slid the phone back into his pocket, his expression unchanged, his stance steady. The gesture was so subtle that many passengers barely noticed, but the attendant did. "Oh, texting your little accomplice now?" she sneered. "What's the plan? To have someone back up your story?" "Let me save you the trouble. Lies won't save you when security gets here." The man gave no reply. His silence was heavier now. Not submission, but something else. Something the passengers couldn't quite name. It was patience. Patience with purpose. Minutes dragged by, stretching longer than they should. The line of waiting travelers grew restless. Parents shifted children from hip to hip. A businessman muttered loudly about missing his connection. A teenager pulled out her phone and started filming, whispering to her friend, "This is crazy. He doesn't even look guilty." But the attendant doubled down, feeding on the discomfort. "Look at this, everyone," she declared, waving the documents as if they were props. "A man who thinks he can waltz in with fake credentials and take a seat that doesn't belong to him. Imagine if I let this slide. What message would that send? That anyone can forge a paper and bypass the rules?" A woman in line finally spoke up, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to humiliate him like this. If there's an issue, can't you just verify his documents quietly?" The attendant turned sharply toward her. "Ma'am, I am doing my job. If I don't protect this airline, who will? He's wasting our time and, frankly, yours too." Her words drew a thin veil of authority, but cracks were showing. Some passengers shifted in agreement with the woman. Others whispered uneasily, questioning whether the man might actually be telling the truth. The ambassador remained still, his silence now commanding the space in a way that no raised voice could. His calm was unnerving, because it didn't fit the role of a guilty man. Guilt is restless, fidgeting, defensive. He was none of those things. He was waiting. And then, something shifted. Down the terminal, two figures in dark suits appeared, walking with deliberate purpose. Their badges glinted under the fluorescent lights, and their presence seemed to ripple through the crowd before they even reached the gate. People stepped aside instinctively, the atmosphere changing in an instant. The attendant saw them too, but mistook their approach for validation. Her lips curled into a triumphant smile. "Ah, perfect," she announced loudly, waving them over. "Security's here. They'll deal with you now." The two men didn't quicken their pace. They didn't even look at her. Their eyes locked straight on the ambassador, and as they drew closer, the tension in the air thickened into something unshakable. Passengers fell silent. Whispers died mid-sentence. The only sound was the steady rhythm of polished shoes on tile. The attendant, still convinced of her authority, leaned toward the ambassador and whispered with relish, "I hope you're ready to be escorted out in front of everyone." but her confidence began to crack the moment the suited men reached the counter, and without hesitation addressed him, not her. "Mr. Ambassador," one of them said, with a respectful nod, his voice firm but deferential. "We apologize for the delay. We came as soon as we received your message." The terminal went utterly still. The passengers blinked, startled, as if the floor had dropped beneath them. The attendant's smile faltered, then collapsed altogether. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The man she had mocked, belittled, and accused was not a fraud. He was the very person she never imagined she'd be standing in front of, the U.S. ambassador himself. And though his hand never moved toward his badge, its weight in his pocket was suddenly undeniable. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone knew it. The sound of the words hung heavy in the terminal. "Mr. Ambassador." Every passenger heard it. The title rang with such authority that it seemed to echo louder than the announcements over the intercom. For a moment, no one moved, as if time itself had stopped in disbelief. The man who had stood quietly under the weight of insults lifted his head slightly, acknowledging the officials with a calm nod. His composure never wavered. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply existed in the truth of who he was, something far more powerful than any outburst could have been. The flight attendant's expression crumbled. Her confident smirk dissolved into a pale, stunned silence. Her hands, still clutching his documents, trembled so slightly that the papers quivered in the air. Her eyes darted between the ambassador and the suited officials, searching desperately for an escape from the reality that had just crashed down on her. One of the officials extended a hand toward the documents. "We'll take those," he said firmly, though his tone was far more respectful than hers had ever been. The attendant obeyed without protest, her voice caught somewhere in her throat. The papers were handled with the care they deserved, each page inspected with precision, each seal and signature recognized for their authenticity. And then, at last, the ambassador moved. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his jacket pocket, the same gesture he had restrained earlier, and withdrew a small leather case. With a flick of his hand, it opened to reveal the unmistakable badge of the United States ambassador. The glint of the polished emblem caught the light, and with it, every ounce of doubt vanished. Gasps swept through the crowd. Passengers who had whispered suspicions moments before now stared wide-eyed, their mouths falling open. A young man who had smirked earlier lowered his gaze, ashamed. The mother with the child whispered, "Oh my God," clutching her daughter a little tighter. The attendant's knees seemed to weaken beneath her. Her face flushed red, then drained of color altogether. She stammered, trying to form words, but nothing coherent left her lips. The badge was undeniable, the title unshakable, and her arrogance, exposed for all to see, was collapsing faster than she could hide it. The ambassador didn't raise his voice. He didn't point a finger or demand retribution. He simply closed the case and slid it back into his pocket, his dignity intact, untouched by her humiliation. His silence spoke louder than any accusation. The official nearest him turned toward the attendant. "Do you realize who you've been addressing this way?" His question wasn't shouted, but the weight behind it struck her harder than if it had been. She swallowed hard, her lips parting, but her answer was a pitiful whisper. I didn't—" "You didn't check," the official interrupted, his voice cutting through her excuse. "You assumed." The word struck the gate like a gavel. Assumption. That was her crime. She hadn't verified, hadn't looked beyond her own prejudice. She had seen an unassuming man and decided he was nothing. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes now fixed not on the ambassador, but on her. The spectacle had flipped. The audience, that once supported her, now silently condemned her. Every whispered insult she had thrown at him was rebounding, amplified by the truth. Her hands trembled more visibly now. She fumbled with her uniform, tugging at her sleeve, adjusting her badge, anything to avoid meeting the ambassador's eyes. She opened her mouth again, perhaps to apologize, but the words caught in her throat. Every sound she tried to make only deepened the silence around her. The ambassador, finally breaking his stillness, turned slightly toward her. His voice was calm, even gentle, but it carried a gravity that silenced even the faintest whisper in the gate. "Respect should never depend on appearances," he said. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't even anger. It was a lesson, a truth spoken not just to her, but to everyone within earshot. His words struck deeper than fury ever could, because they carried the weight of lived experience and undeniable authority. The attendant's eyes brimmed with panic. She nodded rapidly as if agreeing could erase what had already happened, but it was too late. The passengers had seen everything. The officials stood firmly at his side, their posture a clear signal of where power truly belonged. The balance had shifted so completely that the attendant looked smaller now, diminished in her own uniform, a figure stripped of the false authority she had once wielded with such cruelty. The crowd, still hushed, absorbed the transformation. They had witnessed arrogance rise and crumble in the space of minutes. They had seen the power of silence and patience triumph over humiliation, and they would carry that image long after the flight was over. The ambassador, unshaken, collected his documents from the official with a polite nod. "Thank you," he said, his tone simple, steady. He made no demand for her job, no call for punishment, no scene. His dignity alone was enough to render her powerless. The attendant, on the other hand, stood frozen, her trembling hands now clasped together in a feeble attempt at composure. But the damage was done. Everyone in that gate had witnessed her arrogance unravel, and though no one said it out loud, the truth was written across their faces. She had tried to humiliate a man who needed no defense, and instead she had humiliated herself. What no one realized then was that the consequences of her actions had only just begun. The ripple of this moment would follow her far beyond the walls of that terminal. For several beats, the silence at the gate was deafening. The flight attendant, pale and trembling, tried to hold her composure, but the damage was written across her face. Her authority had collapsed, and the crowd knew it. Then came the sound of hurried footsteps. From down the concourse, two managers in sharp suits approached, flanked by a security officer. Their presence shifted the air once again. They hadn't come for the ambassador. They had come for her. "Sir, Ambassador," the lead manager said with a respectful bow of his head, "please accept our deepest apologies. What you've experienced is unacceptable." His tone was firm, but there was an edge of panic. He knew the scene was already bigger than he could contain. Because phones were out. Everywhere. Dozens of passengers, some bold, some discreet, had raised their cameras during the confrontation. The red lights of recording icons glowed in the crowd. Every word the attendant had hurled, every insult, every moment of disbelief, it was all captured. And by the time the managers arrived, some of those clips were already being uploaded, spreading beyond the walls of the terminal. The ambassador inclined his head, still calm, still dignified. He spoke softly, but his words carried. "Respect must be shown to every passenger," he said, "not only to titles." The crowd murmured, agreeing. His restraint only magnified the contrast between his dignity and her collapse. The manager turned then to the flight attendant. His jaw tightened. "You're relieved of duty, effective immediately." She blinked, her mouth opening in protest, but no words came. Her colleagues, once standing beside her with folded arms, now stepped away, distancing themselves from the storm. She was alone, her badge and uniform no longer shields, but weights dragging her down. "You'll be escorted for review," the manager continued, gesturing to security. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried finality. "We will not tolerate conduct that demeans our passengers." The security officer stepped forward. The attendant's hands, trembling more violently now, clutched the edge of her blazer. She nodded stiffly, eyes darting toward the ambassador as if searching for mercy. But he didn't meet her gaze. His silence was not cruel. It was final. The crowd parted as she was led away. No one clapped. No one jeered. The punishment itself was spectacle enough. Passengers who had once muttered support for her now turned their cameras on her retreat, documenting the walk of shame. She had tried to strip another man of dignity, and now hers was gone before an audience of strangers. Moments later, airline staff reassembled, working quickly to repair the damage. Fresh attendants stepped forward, all polite smiles and hushed tones, eager to distance themselves from the chaos. Complimentary vouchers were offered to passengers. The manager himself promised that boarding would resume swiftly, but the mood had shifted permanently. Because the story wasn't staying in that gate. It was already leaving with the speed of Wi-Fi and social media. Clips of the confrontation appeared on timelines within minutes. Flight attendant calls U.S. ambassador a fraud. Humiliation at the gate. Diplomat shuts her down. Comment sections exploded with outrage. Some demanded her firing. Others debated how often such abuses of authority went unchecked. The airline's media team scrambled. Within hours, statements were drafted. Carefully worded apologies issued. Everyone in that gate had witnessed her arrogance unravel. And though no one said it out loud, the truth was written across their faces. She had tried to humiliate a man who needed no defense, and instead, she had humiliated herself. What no one realized then was that the consequences of her actions had only just begun. The ripple of this moment would follow her far beyond the walls of that terminal. For several beats, the silence at the gate was deafening. The flight attendant, pale and trembling, tried to hold her composure, but the damage was written across her face. Her authority had collapsed, and the crowd knew it. Then came the sound of hurried footsteps. From down the concourse, two managers in sharp suits approached, flanked by a security officer. Their presence shifted the air once again. They hadn't come for the ambassador. They had come for her. "Sir, Ambassador," the lead manager said with a respectful bow of his head, "please accept our deepest apologies. What you've experienced is unacceptable." His tone was firm, but there was an edge of panic. He knew the scene was already bigger than he could contain. Because phones were out. Everywhere. Dozens of passengers, some bold, some discreet, had raised their cameras during the confrontation. The red lights of recording icons glowed in the crowd. Every word the attendant had hurled, every insult, every moment of disbelief, it was all captured. And by the time the managers arrived, some of those clips were already being uploaded, spreading beyond the walls of the terminal. The ambassador inclined his head, still calm, still dignified. He spoke softly, but his words carried. "Respect must be shown to every passenger," he said, "not only to titles." The crowd murmured, agreeing. His restraint only magnified the contrast between his dignity and her collapse. The manager turned then to the flight attendant. His jaw tightened. "You're relieved of duty, effective immediately." She blinked, her mouth opening in protest, but no words came. Her colleagues, once standing beside her with folded arms, now stepped away, distancing themselves from the storm. She was alone, her badge and uniform no longer shields, but weights dragging her down. "You'll be escorted for review," the manager continued, gesturing to security. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried finality. "We will not tolerate conduct that demeans our passengers." The security officer stepped forward. The attendant's hands, trembling more violently now, clutched the edge of her blazer. She nodded stiffly, eyes darting toward the ambassador as if searching for mercy. But he didn't meet her gaze. His silence was not cruel. It was final. The crowd parted as she was led away. No one clapped. No one jeered. The punishment itself was spectacle enough. Passengers who had once muttered support for her now turned their cameras on her retreat, documenting the walk of shame. She had tried to strip another man of dignity, and now hers was gone before an audience of strangers. Moments later, airline staff reassembled, working quickly to repair the damage. Fresh attendants stepped forward, all polite smiles and hushed tones, eager to distance themselves from the chaos. Complimentary vouchers were offered to passengers. The manager himself promised that boarding would resume swiftly, but the mood had shifted permanently. Because the story wasn't staying in that gate. It was already leaving with the speed of Wi-Fi and social media. Clips of the confrontation appeared on timelines within minutes. Flight attendant calls U.S. ambassador a fraud. Humiliation at the gate. Diplomat shuts her down. Comment sections exploded with outrage. Some demanded her firing. Others debated how often such abuses of authority went unchecked. They promised a full investigation. They vowed retraining. They declared their respect for all passengers. But the internet was unforgiving. People weren't just angry at the insult to a U.S. ambassador. They were angry because they saw themselves in his shoes. Anyone could imagine being treated that way. Meanwhile, the ambassador boarded quietly, taking his seat like any other traveler. He carried himself with the same humility as before, unaffected by the storm he had just weathered. He didn't gloat, didn't demand the cameras focus on him. His dignity was his victory, and everyone saw it. Back at the gate, the conversation lingered. Passengers whispered to each other about what they had just witnessed. Some admitted they had doubted him. Others confessed they had silently judged. And now they carried the guilt of those assumptions, chastened by the lesson unfolding in real time. The flight attendant's suspension was only the beginning. News networks picked up the viral clips, amplifying the scandal. Analysts debated professionalism, humility, and the dangers of unchecked authority. The airline's stock dipped briefly, a reflection of public distrust. And though her name was never officially released, her image lived in the footage, etched into the story that millions had now seen. She had believed she was in control, wielding power over a man she thought was beneath her. But in the end, her downfall was the very arrogance she had embraced. The ambassador, however, emerged not only unscathed, but admired. To the public, he embodied patience and restraint, proof that true authority doesn't need to be shouted. It only needs to be revealed at the right time. And as the plane finally took off into the night sky, those who had witnessed the confrontation firsthand knew they would never forget it. They had seen arrogance collapse in the face of truth. They had seen dig. Nighty stand taller than humiliation. What no one realized then was just how far the story would travel. By morning, it would no longer belong to that gate or that flight. It would belong to the world. The plane lifted into the night sky, its engines a steady hum against the silence inside the cabin. The ambassador sat quietly in his seat, his hands folded, his face calm. He didn't look like a man who had just been publicly insulted, nor one who had just been vindicated before a crowd. He looked like someone at peace, someone who didn't need to prove himself to anyone. And that, more than anything, was the lesson. He had never raised his voice. He had never demanded to be treated better because of who he was. He endured humiliation with dignity. And when the truth finally revealed itself, it was not because he shouted. It was because the truth has a way of speaking louder than arrogance ever can. All around him, passengers whispered still, exchanging thoughts about what they had witnessed. Some replayed the moment in their minds, the way the flight attendant's smug expression had drained from her face. Others reflected quietly, chastened by how quickly they had assumed she was right. The ambassador gave them no speech, no lecture. His silence was enough. Because the real power in that gate wasn't the badge in his pocket. It was his restraint, his refusal to meet humiliation with anger, his ability to let arrogance reveal itself for what it was, and then allow truth to do the rest. Arrogance built on assumptions always collapses when the truth appears, and the truth, no matter how long it takes, has a way of cutting through noise, and leaving only clarity behind. This story, like so many others, is not just about an airline, a flight attendant, or even an ambassador. It's about the moments we all face when we are tempted to judge others by appearance or to wield authority without humility. Too often, people mistake kindness for weakness or simplicity for insignificance. But every person we meet carries a story, a history, a dignity that deserves respect, whether they wear a title or not. Respect should not depend on who someone is. It should be given because of what they are, human. And that's the moral hidden inside this confrontation. True authority does not need to declare itself. It does not need to humiliate, to raise its voice, or to crush others to prove its strength. True authority is quiet, steady, patient, and when the time comes, undeniable. The flight attendant lost more than a job that day. She lost the illusion of power that comes from belittling others. And in that loss, the world watching was reminded of a universal truth. The way you treat people when you think they are powerless reveals everything about who you are. So the question lingers, not for her, not for the ambassador, but for us. How do we treat others when we don't know who they are? Do we offer respect freely, or only when it feels earned? Do we honor dignity in everyone, or only when we fear authority? Because the truth is, you never know who stands in front of you. It could be a diplomat, it could be a leader, or it could be an ordinary traveler whose dignity is worth just as much. Titles and badges may change the story, but they should never change the respect we give. The ambassador understood that. That's why he didn't need to fight. His calm was his strength. His silence was his power. And when the truth finally came to light, it wasn't just his honor that was restored. It was a reminder for everyone watching that humility lasts longer than arrogance. So as the plane disappeared into the night, leaving behind a trail of whispers, recordings, and lessons, one truth remained steady. Authority doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply waits, and when the moment comes, it speaks with quiet certainty, leaving no doubt. And now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed arrogance crumble in the face of truth? Have you ever seen someone judged unfairly only for the tables to turn? Share your stories in the comments below, because every story is a reminder that respect, humility, and dignity are never optional. They are the true badges we all carry,